Adventures of the Dialectic by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Quotes. Adventures of the Dialectic by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, originally published in 1955, explores the complex relationship between Marxism and existential philosophy. This work critically examines the evolution of Marxist thought, particularly in the post-war context, where ideological divisions were intensifying. Merleau-Ponty investigates the tension between revolutionary theory and political practice, analyzing figures like Lenin, Trotsky, and Sartre, as well as Marxist philosophy itself, to question whether the dialectic can truly reconcile freedom with historical determinism. Through this inquiry, the book confronts the moral and philosophical challenges of Marxism's attempts to realize human emancipation while critiquing the limitations of both Western liberalism and Soviet-style communism. Merleau-Ponty reflects on the role of intellectuals, political violence, and the responsibilities of revolutionaries, offering a nuanced, often skeptical view of whether political ideologies can genuinely address the existential condition of human beings. Quote 1. Truth and freedom are of another order than strife, and cannot subsist without strife. It is equally essential to them to legitimize their adversaries and to confront them. Truth and freedom are not passive ideals. They must engage with conflict in order to sustain themselves. This implies that in a world filled with struggles and contradictions, truth and freedom gain their legitimacy by facing opposition, which forces them to evolve and strengthen. Without such confrontations, they would remain abstract concepts, disconnected from the complexities of reality. Quote 2. The historian's understanding, like that of the physicists, forms an objective truth to the degree that it constructs, and to the degree that the object is only an element in a coherent representation, which can be indefinitely corrected and made more precise, but which never merges with the thing in itself. This statement emphasizes that historical truth is constructed through interpretation and is always open to revision. Just as in science, historical understanding cannot fully capture the totality of the past. It is a model that represents reality, but never perfectly aligns with it. Therefore, the process of historical understanding is one of continual refinement, acknowledging the partial nature of any interpretation. Quote 3. The past that I contemplate has been lived, and as soon as I want to enter into its genesis, I cannot be unaware that it has been a present. Merleau-Ponty is highlighting the temporal connection between the past and the present. The past, though viewed from a distance, was once someone's present reality, full of uncertainty and action. This reflection underlines the notion that historical analysis is not just a detached observation, but also an empathetic reconstruction of lived experiences, binding the historian to the present moment of decision-making. Quote 4. Knowledge is never categorical. It is always open to revision. Nothing can make us be the past. It is only a spectacle before us, which is there for us to question. This quote suggests that knowledge, especially historical knowledge, is always incomplete and subject to change. The past cannot be fully known or relived. It remains a distant spectacle that we can only attempt to understand through questioning. This fluidity of knowledge reinforces the importance of remaining open to new interpretations and perspectives. Quote 5. The capitalistic economy of the present day is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born, and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. In this reflection on capitalism, Merleau-Ponty, referencing Weber, indicates that the capitalist system has become a seemingly natural and unchangeable structure in which individuals are embedded from birth. It functions as a vast, overpowering force that shapes life, imposing its own rules and demands on individuals, often making alternatives appear impossible within the system itself. Quote 6. There is thus a religious efficacy and an economic efficacy. Weber describes them as interwoven exchanging positions so that now one, now the other, plays the role of tutor. This insight reveals Weber's understanding that religious beliefs and economic systems influence and reinforce each other. They are not independent spheres, but are deeply interconnected, with each shaping the development and functioning of the other. This reciprocal relationship shows how values, spiritual practices, and material conditions are closely intertwined in human history. Quote 7. History is a strange object, an object which is ourselves. Merleau-Ponty points out that history is not something external or separate from us. It is the sum of human actions and decisions. Since we are both products of history and participants in it, studying history is also a way of understanding ourselves. This reflection emphasizes the personal and collective nature of historical inquiry, as it shapes our identities and realities. Quote 8. The past, moreover, comes forward to meet the judgments we pass upon it. It has judged itself. Having been lived by men, it has introduced values into history. The past is not a static entity. It actively presents itself to us, shaped by the values and actions of those who lived it. Our judgments on historical events must take into account that those events carry their own intrinsic values, having been determined by the people involved. The past is not merely for us to interpret, but it has already contributed its own meaning to the ongoing flow of history, making our understanding a dialogue with the past. Quote 9. Truth, says Weber, is that which seeks to be recognized by all those who seek the truth. Truth is not subjective, but it must be open to recognition by those who genuinely search for it. It implies a universal dimension to truth, one that transcends personal biases or limited perspectives. This suggests that truth, while perhaps elusive, is something that individuals across time and space can collectively approach if they are sincerely committed to understanding it. Quote 10. It is the destiny of a cultural epoch which has tasted of the tree of knowledge to know that we cannot decipher the meaning of world events, regardless of how completely we may study them. Cultural epochs that possess deep self-awareness, having gained knowledge and understanding, are bound to recognize the limits of human comprehension regarding world events. No matter how thoroughly we analyze history, some meanings remain beyond our reach, highlighting the inherent ambiguity and complexity of global events. This suggests a humble approach to historical interpretation, acknowledging that ultimate understanding may never be fully achieved. Quote 11. History is not an external God, a hidden reason of which we have only to record the conclusions. It is the metaphysical fact that the same life, our own, is played out both within us and outside us, in our present and in our past. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that history is not an external force dictating outcomes, but is an integral part of human existence, shaping and being shaped by our lives. It resides both in the individual and the collective, in the present and the past, demonstrating the interconnectedness of personal experiences and larger historical forces. This view frames history as something active and alive, constantly influencing and being influenced by human actions. Quote 12. Projects change so much in the course of things that the lessons taught by events are not reaped, since the generations of men who make the accounting are not those who began the experiment. This quote reflects the transient nature of human endeavors. Often, the lessons of historical events are lost because the people who experience the consequences are not the ones who initiated the events. This disconnect between the originators of actions and those who assess the outcomes shows how history evolves in unexpected ways, with each generation interpreting and reacting to the past differently, leading to incomplete or misunderstood lessons. Quote 13. Weber's liberalism is militant, even suffering, heroic. It recognizes the rights of its adversaries, refuses to hate them, does not try to avoid confronting them, and, in order to refute them, relies only upon their own contradictions and upon discussions which expose these. Weber's version of liberalism is not passive or complacent, but is a determined and courageous stance that seeks truth through struggle and debate. It respects the rights of its opponents while rejecting hatred, and instead focuses on confronting and revealing their contradictions through dialogue. This perspective portrays liberalism as a dynamic force that thrives on engagement and conflict, rather than suppression or avoidance of dissent. Quote 14. Demystification is also depoetization and disenchantment. We must keep the capitalistic refusal of the sacred as external, but renew within it the demands of the absolute that it has abolished. As societies demystify the world through capitalism and rationalization, they lose a sense of enchantment and sacredness. However, Merleau-Ponty suggests that while we maintain the practical, disenchanted framework of capitalism, there is a need to reintegrate a sense of the absolute, of deeper meaning, into this rationalized world. This highlights the tension between modernity's efficiency and the human need for transcendent values and purpose. Quote 15. History is not only an object in front of us, far from us, beyond our reach. It is also our awakening as subjects. History is not something external or distant from us. Rather, it is intricately tied to our own consciousness and development as subjects. As we engage with history, we become aware of our own role within it, not merely as observers, but as participants. This understanding transforms history from a static object into an evolving dynamic relationship between the past and our present understanding. Quote 16. We are never able to refer to completed totality, to universal history, as if we were not within it, as if it were spread out in front of us. This quote reflects the idea that we are always embedded within history and can never fully step outside of it to observe a complete or universal perspective. Our knowledge of history is always partial and ongoing, shaped by our position within it. The notion of a total, all-encompassing view of history is unattainable, because we are constantly part of the historical process ourselves. Quote 17. History is philosophy realized, as philosophy is history formalized, reduced to its internal articulations, to its intelligible structure. Merleau-Ponty suggests that history and philosophy are deeply interconnected. History is the lived realization of philosophical ideas, while philosophy is the process of formalizing and organizing history's chaotic flow into understandable structures. This intertwining of philosophy and history means that both seek to interpret human existence and the world, but they do so through different lenses. Quote 18. As it becomes material, the dialectic must grow heavy. In Marx, spirit becomes a thing, while things become saturated with spirit. This quote illustrates Marx's concept of materialism, where abstract ideas and spiritual elements take on physical form, and material realities are imbued with meaning. The dialectic, in becoming grounded in material conditions, acquires a weight and concreteness that goes beyond mere intellectual discourse, reflecting how ideas shape and are shaped by the tangible world. Quote 19. The dialectic of things only makes the problems more urgent. It is the total dialectic in which the subject interposes its authority, which can find a solution to the problems. The dialectical movement of material realities only intensifies societal problems. It is not enough for the dialectic of external forces to operate on its own. It requires human intervention, the conscious subject, to guide and resolve these tensions. This interplay between the material world and human agency is essential for addressing the contradictions that arise in history. Quote 20. All progress is then relative in the profound sense that the very historical movement which inscribes it in things brings to the fore the problem of decadence. This quote reflects the idea that progress is always accompanied by the potential for decline. As history advances, the achievements of one period may lead to new challenges or the decay of previously successful systems. Progress is never absolute, but always provisional, requiring constant re-evaluation and adaptation to prevent stagnation or regression. Quote 21. There is less a sense of history than an elimination of nonsense. No sooner does the direction of becoming indicate itself than it is already compromised. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that history does not move toward a predetermined, coherent goal. Instead, it is an ongoing process of eliminating confusion and disorder. Even as a sense of direction in history emerges, it is immediately complicated by new developments and contradictions, making the historical process one of continual revision and reinterpretation. Quote 22. The proletariat is an intention of totality, or the totality in intention, the correct view of the overall economic situation. The proletariat is seen as embodying the potential to understand and transform society. It represents the full awareness of the social and economic structures, even if this knowledge is not fully realized in practice. The proletariat's position within capitalist society gives it a unique insight into the entire economic system, positioning it as a class capable of leading the way toward a more just and complete societal order. Quote 23. History provides its own interpretation by producing, along with the proletariat, its own consciousness. History is not a passive sequence of events, but an active process that creates its own awareness through the development of the proletariat. The rise of the working class is not just a social or economic phenomenon, it is also the means by which history reflects upon itself, generating the consciousness necessary for its own transformation. The proletariat, in this sense, is both a product of history and the agent of its future direction. Quote 24. The proletariat only perfects itself by annihilating and transcending itself, by creating the classless society through the successful conclusion of its own class struggle. This quote highlights the paradox of the proletariat's historical mission. Its ultimate goal is to eliminate all class distinctions, including its own existence as a class. The proletariat achieves its purpose not by remaining a permanent entity, but by dissolving the very system that defines it, thereby establishing a classless society. This self-negation is the key to its revolutionary role. Quote 25. Class consciousness in the proletariat is not a state of mind, nor is it knowledge. It is a praxis. Class consciousness in the proletariat is more than mere intellectual understanding or a fixed mindset. It is a form of action or praxis. This consciousness arises from the lived conditions of workers and is expressed through their collective activities, struggles, and movements. Praxis here signifies the practical engagement with the world that goes beyond theoretical contemplation, embodying the dynamic process through which the proletariat interacts with and transforms society. Quote 26. The party's operation must prove that beyond capitalistic history there is another history, wherein one does not have to choose between the role of subject and object. The function of the party is to demonstrate that there is an alternative to capitalist history, one in which individuals are not forced into rigid roles as either subjects, those who act, or objects, those who are acted upon. In this new historical framework, individuals can engage in a cooperative and self-directed manner, transcending the alienating dualism of capitalist relations. The party's goal is to facilitate the creation of a new social order based on mutual recognition and shared purpose. Quote 27. The profound philosophical meaning of the notion of praxis is to place us in an order which is not that of knowledge, but rather that of communication, exchange, and association. Praxis, as understood by Marxism, is not merely about acquiring knowledge or understanding the world, it is about participating in the process of communication and collective action. This concept emphasizes the importance of human relationships, collaboration, and shared struggles in shaping history. Praxis is the dynamic interaction between people, where ideas and actions come together to transform society. Quote 28. The truth of Marxism is not the truth one attributes to the natural sciences, the similarity of an idea and its external ideatum. It is rather non-falsity, the maximum guarantee against error that men may demand and get. Marxist truth is not based on the same criteria as scientific truth, which seeks to match ideas with external reality. Instead, Marxist truth is about avoiding errors in understanding and acting upon historical processes. It represents a commitment to the most reliable and comprehensive understanding of social dynamics, one that enables individuals and classes to engage in transformative action with confidence, even in the face of uncertainty. Quote 29. Lukács' main theses, the relativization of subject and object, the movement of society toward self-knowledge, and truth seen as a presumptive totality to be reached through a permanent self-criticism, are already there as soon as one attempts to develop the Marxist idea of a concrete dialectic and a realized philosophy. Lukács's core ideas reflect the continuous interplay between subject and object in Marxism, where society progresses toward a greater understanding of itself through an ongoing process of self-reflection. Truth is not a fixed entity, but an evolving whole, achieved through self-criticism and dialectical thought. This idea supports the Marxist notion that philosophical development and social progress are inseparably linked, with self-criticism as a driving force behind this movement. Quote 30. It is no longer a question of saving Hegel from abstraction, of recreating the dialectic by entrusting it to the very movement of its content without any idealistic postulate. It is rather a question of annexing Hegel's logic to the economy. In later Marxism, Hegel's dialectic is no longer used as a method to understand abstract philosophical ideas, but is instead applied to economic structures. This shifts the focus from the fluid, self-developing process of dialectics toward a more rigid application to material and economic relations, reducing Hegel's method to a tool for analyzing external forces rather than for understanding the dynamic relationship between ideas and reality. Quote 31. The economic apparatus, whether to be overthrown or to be constructed, which according to Marx was a relationship between persons mediated by things, practically ceases to appear as a relationship between persons and becomes almost completely a thing. Marx's concept of the economy as a set of relationships between people has been transformed into something impersonal and objectified. Instead of viewing economic structures as mediated human interactions, the economic apparatus becomes reified, treated as a separate entity devoid of human relationships. This reflects the alienation that occurs in both capitalist and planned economies, where human connections are obscured by the dominance of impersonal economic forces. Quote 32. Realism ends by substituting a simple schema of progress for the difficult reading of the anticipations and delays of history and for the rigorous examination of revolutionary society. In Marxist realism, the complexity of historical development is reduced to a simplistic narrative of inevitable progress. This approach overlooks the nuanced, often contradictory processes that shape historical change, and it dismisses the need for critical reflection on the actual state of revolutionary societies. By doing so, realism neglects the dialectical method's requirement for ongoing scrutiny and self-criticism in understanding and guiding social transformation. Quote 33. Orthodoxy does not want to be a higher truth or true for reasons which are not its own. It claims for itself the truth of the thing itself. Marxist orthodoxy rejects the idea of truth that is externally justified or critically examined. Instead, it asserts its own absolute truth, disconnected from any deeper philosophical or dialectical scrutiny. This creates a closed system that does not allow for the self-criticism or intellectual flexibility necessary to adapt and refine Marxist theory in response to evolving historical realities. Quote 34. Thus, realism ends by eliminating any reference to an interior of history or of literature or philosophy. There must be only one urgency: the existing social process and its completion in the USSR. Marxist realism in this context prioritizes the existing social process as the sole focus of historical analysis, ignoring the deeper, more complex dimensions of history, literature, or philosophy. By doing so, it reduces the richness of human experience to a single, predetermined trajectory of progress centered on the Soviet Union, undermining the dialectical method's emphasis on internal contradictions and diverse interpretations. Quote 35. In the end, communism's intellectual profile is a fast and loose philosophical system which disarms the dialectic by denying to the subject the judgment of history and the intrinsic appreciation of literature and politics. Communism's theoretical approach, as presented here, undermines the power of dialectical thinking by removing the subject's ability to critically engage with and judge history. It strips individuals of their capacity to interpret and assess the unfolding of history, literature, and politics, turning Marxism into a rigid system that stifles the dynamic, self-reflective process essential to dialectical thought. Quote 36. If our means do not announce even our remote ends, at least by some quality which distinguishes them, they change the direction of history. The ends then pass into the means, and the means pass into the ends. Trotsky emphasizes the importance of consistency between the methods used in revolutionary politics and the ultimate goals. If the means used do not reflect the intended future, they can distort or even derail the revolution. The means and ends are not separate, but interconnected, with each influencing the other. For Trotsky, the revolutionary process must ensure that the actions taken today resonate with the broader goals of justice and freedom, or else the revolution risks betraying itself. Quote 37. Revolutionary realism, unlike technical action, never aims at external results alone. It wants only a result which can be understood, for if its result were not understandable, there would be no revolution. In Trotsky's view, revolutionary actions must not only achieve concrete results, but also be comprehensible to the masses. The revolution's success lies in its ability to educate and engage people, making them active participants in shaping their future. If the revolutionary process is too opaque or disconnected from the people's understanding, it loses its transformative power and risks becoming mere technical manipulation rather than a genuine mass movement. Quote 38. The party is not admitted to the supposed verdicts of historical reason. There is no ready-made historical reason. There is a meaning of history sketched in the convulsions of spontaneous history and a voluntary and methodological recovery of history which reflects this meaning back into history. Trotsky rejects the idea that history follows a predetermined course with a clear, inevitable logic. Instead, he argues that history is shaped by human actions and decisions, with its meaning emerging from the chaos and struggles of the moment. The party plays a critical role in interpreting and shaping this unfolding history, but it does so without possessing any privileged access to a final or absolute truth. History is made through conscious collective action, not through blind adherence to preordained outcomes. Quote 39. If the party rejects these criteria, then to confront it with true history, which it fails to recognize, is to confront it with history as thought by Trotsky. This is to say that the party is no longer in the party, but is rather to be found totally in Trotsky, and in those who think like him. Here, Trotsky grapples with the dilemma of remaining loyal to a party that deviates from its revolutionary principles. He acknowledges that if the party ceases to embody the truth of the proletarian revolution, the truth must exist outside of the party. This creates a paradox where Trotsky and his followers, rather than the party itself, become the true carriers of revolutionary ideals. This tension highlights the difficulty of maintaining fidelity to a movement that has lost its way. Quote 40. Trotsky hesitated to situate truth outside the party because Marxism had taught him that truth could not in principle reside anywhere but at the point where the proletariat and the organization which embodies it are joined. Trotsky's hesitation to break with the party stems from a deeply ingrained Marxist belief that the truth of the revolution is inseparable from the proletariat and the organization, the party, that represents it. This belief makes it nearly impossible for Trotsky to imagine a revolutionary truth existing independently of the party, even as the party itself becomes increasingly disconnected from the proletarian cause. His loyalty to Marxist principles ultimately keeps him bound to the party, even when its actions betray the revolution. Quote 41. Trotsky was not able to foresee a derailment of the dialectic in the country of the revolution, and bowed to the fact only when constrained and forced to do so. Trotsky's inability to predict the degeneration of the revolution in the Soviet Union reflects the limits of dialectical materialism as it was conceived. He could not anticipate that the very forces meant to sustain the revolution could turn against it, and he only recognized this shift when it became undeniable. This shows how deeply Trotsky's understanding of Marxist theory was tied to the belief in the inevitable success of the revolution, even in the face of growing evidence to the contrary. Quote 42. The fetishism of collectivization and planning is the aspect that dialectical materialism takes when history separates economic categories from political forms. This quote critiques the way Marxist theory, through dialectical materialism, sometimes elevates economic structures, like collectivization and planning, over the political and social realities they are meant to serve. When the revolution prioritizes economic organization at the expense of human relationships and political participation, it creates a form of fetishism, treating these economic processes as ends in themselves, rather than as tools for achieving broader social goals. Quote 43. Passivity toward the party is the stance that discipline and centralism take when the party ceases to be democratic. When the party loses its democratic essence, adherence to discipline and centralism transforms into passive acceptance. This indicates that the once vibrant and participatory nature of the party has degenerated into a rigid, unquestioning structure. In such circumstances, the individuals within the party no longer challenge or actively contribute to its direction, instead following orders without engagement, which ultimately undermines the revolutionary spirit of the party itself. Quote 44. If revolution is in things, how can one hesitate to brush aside, by any means, oppositions which are only apparent? This statement reflects the deterministic view within Marxist theory that revolution is embedded in the very structure of society. If revolution is seen as inevitable, any opposition to it is regarded as superficial or temporary, justifying the use of extreme measures to eliminate dissent. This perspective can lead to a dangerous willingness to employ violence or coercion, believing that such actions are merely clearing the way for an inevitable outcome inscribed in the fabric of history. Quote 45. Revolution is no longer history's fulfillment. It also takes shape in societies which did not hatch it. It is always there and also never there, since even in mature societies, it can be indefinitely late. Revolution is not simply the natural conclusion of historical processes, but rather a force that can emerge unpredictably, even in societies that have not fully matured for such a transformation. This view acknowledges that revolution may never occur exactly as expected, yet it is always a latent possibility within any society. The notion of revolution becomes more complex and elusive, as it is not strictly tied to predetermined historical development, but remains an ever-present potential. Quote 46. Trotsky's formulation showed that in addition to the objective conditions of history and the will of men, there is a third order, that of the internal mechanism of revolutionary action. Trotsky introduces the idea that revolutionary action is driven by more than just historical conditions and human will. It also involves an internal dynamic unique to the revolutionary process itself. This mechanism can propel the revolution beyond what objective circumstances might suggest, revealing a deeper, more unpredictable force at work in historical change. This third element complicates the simple narrative of revolution, adding a layer of spontaneity and unforeseen consequences. Quote 47. Permanent revolution is this myth, the underground work of the negative which never ceases, especially not in the revolutionary society. The idea of permanent revolution becomes a kind of myth that imagines a continuous, never-ending process of critique and transformation, even within revolutionary societies. This concept suggests that the revolutionary spirit should never settle or stabilize, but must remain in a constant state of self-criticism and renewal. However, the difficulty lies in maintaining such perpetual momentum without falling into violence or authoritarianism, as this ceaseless negation can conflict with the practical realities of governance. Quote 48. Even after his expulsion, he never drew the philosophical conclusion from his failure. He restricted himself to recreating Bolshevism outside of Bolshevism, Marxism outside of Stalinism. Despite being expelled and witnessing the failures of Bolshevism, Trotsky never fundamentally questioned the underlying philosophical framework that guided him. Instead, he sought to replicate the ideals of Bolshevism and Marxism outside of their corrupted forms under Stalin. This suggests a reluctance or inability to fully confront the flaws in the very principles that had guided the revolution, opting instead to preserve those ideals in a different context without addressing their inherent contradictions. Quote 49. Revolution as continued self-criticism needs violence to establish itself, and ceases to be self-critical to the extent that it practices violence. Revolutionary movements rely on self-criticism and constant reflection to maintain their vitality, but once they resort to violence to sustain themselves, they lose their capacity for introspection. Violence, though sometimes necessary in revolutionary contexts, ultimately undermines the revolution's ability to engage in the critical, self-correcting processes that are essential for genuine transformation. This tension between violence and self-criticism highlights a fundamental dilemma in revolutionary praxis. Quote 50. The dialectic in action responds to adversity either by means of terror exercised in the name of a hidden truth or by opportunism. In either case, the dialectic wanders from its own line. In practice, the dialectic can become distorted when faced with adversity, leading to either oppressive measures in the name of a supposed truth or opportunistic actions that betray the original revolutionary principles. In both instances, the dialectic strays from its intended path, losing its capacity to serve as a guide for genuine revolutionary progress, and instead becoming a tool for manipulation or violence. Quote 51. Once the machinery of production, which Marx took for granted, and which was indeed not present in Russia and is even less evident in China, has been built, state production will of itself put forth its socialist and communist consequences. This quote critiques the Marxist assumption that the establishment of state-controlled production would automatically lead to the development of socialist or communist outcomes. In societies like Russia and China, where the necessary production structures were lacking, this belief was proven overly simplistic. The assumption ignores the complexities of societal transformation and the need for more than just material conditions to bring about true socialism. Quote 52. They take its failure into consideration, and in this sense they know it is a failure, since at every opportunity they avoid the dialectic with great care. But with the same movement, they place it in the future. Communists are aware that the dialectic is not functioning as intended, but continue to defer its realization to some distant future. This awareness of failure, combined with a refusal to confront it in the present, turns the dialectic into a future ideal rather than an active present reality. This disconnection allows the communist ideology to persist, even as it fails to live up to its promises in the immediate context. Quote 53. Sartre founds communist action precisely by refusing any productivity to history, and by making history, insofar as it is intelligible, the immediate result of our volitions. Sartre rejects the idea that history has an inherent logic or productivity. For him, history is not a deterministic process, but is instead shaped directly by human will and decisions. This shift places the burden of revolutionary action on individual and collective agency, rather than relying on a predetermined historical progression. History, in Sartre's view, is what we make of it through our conscious choices and actions. Quote 54. Marxism has always been the choice of the proletariat, which, historically, does not exist, in opposition to the other, which does. Marxism is framed here as an ideology centered around a proletariat that, paradoxically, does not yet exist as a cohesive historical force. Instead, it is defined in opposition to the existing structures and classes, which are concrete. This statement highlights the abstract and future-oriented nature of Marxist theory, where the proletariat is more of an ideal or a projected class than a present reality. Quote 55. Communism is not to be judged, to be put in place, or to be reconciled with anything other than itself. Its action is not to be measured by any criterion other than itself, because it is the only consequential attempt to create, out of nothing, a society where those who are nothing become men. Sartre argues that communism is beyond external judgment or comparison because it represents the only serious effort to bring about a society in which the oppressed can rise and become fully realized individuals. This action is self-justifying, meaning that it does not need to adhere to conventional moral or rational criteria. Communism, in this view, is an act of pure creation aimed at transforming society from nothingness into a space where human potential can be fully realized. Quote 56. The question is not to know who, from the class or the party, makes the proletariat's political history. These problems of causality, which have very little meaning in nature, have even less when dealing with society. This quote emphasizes that the creation of the proletariat's political history is not about determining whether it is the class itself or the party that leads. The issue of causality, which might have relevance in natural sciences, is less significant when applied to social and political contexts. In politics, the relationship between the proletariat and the party is dynamic and intertwined, with both influencing each other. This interdependence shapes the course of political action, rather than a simplistic cause and effect scenario. Quote 57. What stops Sartre from admitting this substantial action, in which there is neither pure authority nor pure obedience, and which, in its culmination, is called revolution, is a philosophy in which meaning, seen as wholly spiritual, as impalpable as lightning, is absolutely opposed to being, which is absolute weight and blindness. Sartre is prevented from fully accepting the Marxist conception of revolution because his philosophy creates a divide between meaning and existence. For Sartre, meaning is seen as intangible and disconnected from the concrete reality of being, which he views as heavy and blind. This perspective makes it difficult for him to reconcile the idea of revolution as a material, collective action, rooted in both the proletariat and the party, with his philosophy that treats meaning as something that transcends the material world. Quote 58. For Marx, there was, and for Sartre, there is not, a coming to be of meaning in institutions. Marx believed that meaning emerges through the development of institutions and collective action, while Sartre rejects this idea. Sartre's philosophy does not allow for the creation of meaning through social and institutional processes, but rather views meaning as something that originates solely from individual volition. This fundamental difference highlights the contrast between Marx's materialist dialectic and Sartre's more existential approach to history and society. Quote 59. There is no criterion or geometrical definition which, in the abstract and outside a given situation, permitted one to say what is or is not proletarian. This quote reflects the fluidity and complexity of defining what is truly proletarian. Marxism does not provide a rigid, abstract standard for determining proletarian action or identity. Instead, these are contextual, shaped by concrete situations and the lived experiences of the proletariat. This lack of a fixed definition means that proletarian consciousness and actions are constantly evolving, dependent on historical and social circumstances. Quote 60. The revolution cannot come from the worker, and especially not from the skilled worker. He has a recognized value. He is encumbered with his talent. He is not ready for the rape of freedom. Sartre asserts that revolution cannot originate from the skilled worker because their established role and recognized value within the capitalist system make them less inclined to embrace radical freedom. Their attachment to their skills and place in society binds them to the existing order, making it harder for them to engage in revolutionary action that demands a total break from the status quo. This contrasts with Marx's view, where the working class, regardless of skill, is seen as the primary agent of revolutionary change. Quote 61. The party rests on nothing that has been established, not even on their common history. Either the party of the proletarians never will exist, or, if it exists, it will be their continued creation and the emblem of their non-being. Sartre views the Communist Party as an entity that is not built on an established foundation, even one based on shared history. It exists only through the ongoing collective action of the proletariat and reflects their constant state of becoming. The party, therefore, is not a static institution, but a dynamic process, perpetually created and recreated by revolutionary action, embodying the proletariat's struggle for self-realization in a world that denies their existence. Quote 62. The October generation, like the young Marx, believed in an action which verifies itself, in a truth which comes to be in the life of the party and the proletariat. The generation of revolutionaries from the October Revolution, like the young Marx, believed that revolutionary action is self-validating and that truth emerges through the collective life and actions of the party and the proletariat. This reflects a faith in the dialectical process, where actions undertaken by the party and the working class reveal and shape historical truth through their real-world consequences. This belief contrasts with later forms of Marxism that may disconnect action from its revolutionary ideals. Quote 63. Revolution is defined only by its antagonism toward the class that it eliminates. This is no longer the revolution, the founding anew of all things under the aegis of the last class, a creative imbalance which, once in motion, will not stop, history supporting itself on itself to rise above itself. Sartre's version of revolution is framed as a purely negative force, defined by its opposition to the bourgeois class, rather than as a transformative process that reinvents society. In this view, revolution loses its expansive, creative potential and becomes a stagnant struggle limited to eliminating its adversary, rather than a continuous redefinition of history and society. This shift marks a departure from the broader, dynamic conception of revolution in Marxist thought, where revolution is seen as a force that evolves beyond its initial conflicts. Quote 64. My own field of thought and action is made up of imperfect meanings, badly defined and interrupted. They are completed over there, in the others who hold the key to them, because they see sides of things that I do not see. Sartre emphasizes the intersubjective nature of understanding, where individuals are limited by their own perspectives and rely on others to complete or expand their interpretations of the world. Meaning is not generated in isolation. It is shared and constructed through social interaction. This collective process of understanding highlights the incompleteness of individual consciousness and the importance of engaging with others to grasp the full complexity of reality. Quote 65. Intentions without consciousness, actions without subjects, human relationships without men, participating at once in material necessity and finality, such are generally our undertakings when they develop freely in the dimension of objectivity. Sartre describes how human actions and relationships can become objectified and detached from individual intentions, taking on a life of their own. When human activities become embedded in social structures or material processes, they often lose their original meaning, turning into impersonal forces that shape lives without conscious control. This alienation reflects the way social and economic systems can distance individuals from their own actions, reducing human relationships to abstract, objective interactions. Quote 66. For Sartre, the social whole never starts moving by itself, never yields more movement than it has received from inassimilable and irreducible consciousnesses. In Sartre's philosophy, society does not possess an inherent capacity for change or evolution. It only moves when driven by the conscious will of individuals. He rejects the Marxist notion that historical processes have their own internal dynamics, instead arguing that all social and political movements are the result of personal decisions and individual actions. This contrasts with Marxist thought, which sees history as shaped by broader material forces and collective struggles. Quote 67. The proletariat will be true if it itself acts, but for the moment, it rises up in history only under the form of magical connections, and history shows in it its mystical essence. Sartre argues that the proletariat's role in history is still unrealized, existing more as a potential or an idea rather than an active, transformative force. When the proletariat does act, it will fulfill its historical mission, but, until then, it remains bound in a kind of mystical state, where its power is more imagined than real. This notion highlights the gap between the proletariat's revolutionary potential and its current passive state in society. Quote 68. There can be a truth, a rationality of the bourgeoisie as a servicing of certain interests. There is in it a given sociality. The values of truth and reason are in complicity with it, because it is in its interest to make people believe that man and the world are thinkable and therefore already made. Sartre critiques the way bourgeois society uses reason and truth to justify and perpetuate its dominance. For the bourgeoisie, truth and rationality are not neutral concepts, but tools that serve their interests by maintaining the status quo. This worldview convinces people that the world is fixed and unchangeable, discouraging revolutionary thought or action. The bourgeoisie thus sustains its power by making its version of reality appear natural and inevitable. Quote 69. Confidence will therefore be hollow and infinite. The working class has coherence and power only insofar as it has confidence in the leaders. The leader interprets the situation, illuminates it by his plans, at his own risk, and the working class, by observing the directives, legitimizes the authority of the leader. Sartre explores the problematic nature of trust between the working class and its leaders, where the power of the working class is contingent on its faith in the leadership. However, this trust is fragile and often empty, based on the leader's ability to interpret events and make decisions rather than on a shared, active participation. The legitimacy of leadership thus relies on maintaining the workers' confidence, which can be tenuous and dependent on the outcomes of the leader's decisions. Quote 70. When a communist makes known the interests or the feelings of the proletariat, rightly or wrongly, it is in the name of the proletariat that he speaks. Sartre points out the problematic nature of a communist leader claiming to speak for the proletariat, whether or not they accurately represent the proletariat's interests. This authority granted to the communist leader, even when wrong, allows them to wield immense power over the working class without sufficient accountability. Sartre challenges the assumption that leaders are always justified in speaking for the masses, questioning how one can determine the correctness of such representation and highlighting the absence of a mechanism for proletarian self-expression in communist politics. Quote 71. There is no exchange between those who conceive the politics and those who execute it. The leader gives a meaning to the situation. The class carries out the orders. In Sartre's view, the relationship between the communist leadership and the proletariat is one-sided. Leaders determine the direction and meaning of political action, while the working class is expected to follow without contributing to the formulation of strategy. This disconnect between leadership and the masses creates a hierarchical system in which the proletariat is reduced to a passive force, obeying commands rather than actively participating in the shaping of its own political destiny. Quote 72. There is no conceivable adjustment between the principle of communist politics and its line, the principle being of the order of duty, the line of the order of fact. Sartre critiques the rigid separation between communist ideology and the practical decisions made by the party. He argues that communist politics operates on two incompatible levels. ideological principles, which are treated as moral imperatives, and political strategy, which is seen as the necessary course of action. This disconnection prevents critical reflection on whether the party's actions truly align with its ideological commitments, allowing the leadership to claim legitimacy without being accountable to the proletariat or its principles. Quote 73. The worker gives himself to his leader, so that in his person the group exists. The leader thus has charismatic power. He lives in the group, as consciousness lives in the body. Sartre observes the almost mystical relationship between the leader and the proletariat in communist movements. The leader is seen as the embodiment of the collective will of the working class, possessing a kind of charismatic authority that makes him inseparable from the group's identity. This dynamic places the leader at the center of political action, with the masses relying on his direction and decisions, reinforcing a system where the individual worker's agency is subsumed by the leader's authority. Quote 74. If there is a leader, everyone is leader in the name of the leader, not only because he makes others obey him, but especially because, in obeying the leader, it is one's own better self that one obeys. Sartre describes how obedience to the communist leader is rationalized as a higher form of self-discipline. By following the leader, individuals are made to believe they are acting in accordance with their best selves, even when they are submitting to authority. This belief transforms obedience into a form of personal fulfillment, blurring the line between individual autonomy and subservience to the party's directives, and complicating the relationship between freedom and control within the revolutionary movement. Quote 75. Communism crosses over into the realm of the imaginary. It is the outer limit of the vertiginous encounter of persons. It is the imaginary become institution or myth. Sartre suggests that communism, in its idealized form, transcends reality and becomes more of a myth or an imaginary construct. The idea of a perfect communal society, where relationships between individuals are pure and egalitarian, remains an abstract ideal rather than a tangible reality. This utopian vision creates a disconnect between the theoretical goals of communism and the messy, imperfect nature of political life, where compromises and power dynamics inevitably come into play. Quote 76. History is action. The acts and the words of a party and a government cannot be judged according to the single criterion of what is true. Rather, one must consider the whole, form truth with force, impose a truth which, for the moment, is class truth, and only later will be everyone's truth. Sartre argues that in revolutionary movements, truth is not a static or objective concept, but something that is constructed through action and power. The Communist Party's version of truth, while tied to the interests of the proletariat, is imposed through force and is contingent upon the outcome of the revolution. Over time, this class-based truth might evolve into a more universal truth, but in the immediate context of struggle, it serves the needs of the working class and justifies the party's actions in the name of revolution. Quote 77. In social life, there are no things done together. They must be invented. One must here create from nothing the milieu of a common enterprise or history, and one must even create the subjects of this enterprise, the party. Sartre argues that collective action is not something that naturally exists in society. It must be actively created. The party becomes the vehicle for generating this shared enterprise, as individuals must come together and construct a common project from scratch. This process involves not only creating a shared goal, but also transforming individuals into subjects who can participate in this collective action, highlighting the intentional and constructed nature of revolutionary movements. Quote 78. Choice, freedom, and effort become conquest and violence in order to become everyone's affair. Here, Sartre discusses how abstract concepts like freedom and choice, when applied to revolutionary contexts, inevitably lead to violence. In order for revolutionary action to be meaningful for all, these ideals must be realized through the conquest of existing structures, even if it involves force. Sartre's view suggests that revolution, to be effective, transforms these philosophical notions into concrete and sometimes violent actions that engage the entire society. Quote 79. Pure action is only the root of freedom. As soon as it is applied, it is in a world of probable relations, in a situation where it must find its way and accept mediations. Sartre emphasizes that while pure action may symbolize the essence of freedom, its actual implementation in the real world becomes complicated by practical considerations. Once revolutionary action is set in motion, it must navigate a web of relationships and compromises, losing its initial purity. This reflection underscores the gap between revolutionary ideals and the messy realities of political action, where mediation and adaptation are necessary. Quote 80. The pure will to change the world is nothing but inner life, so long as we are not told how to do it. In this statement, Sartre highlights the limits of merely desiring revolutionary change without a concrete plan for how to achieve it. The will to change the world, without specific strategies or actions, remains an internal, almost philosophical, exercise. This critique points to the need for practical, actionable steps to translate revolutionary intent into real-world outcomes, reinforcing the importance of effective leadership and clear direction in political movements. Quote 81. The proletariat of which Sartre is speaking is not verifiable, debatable, or living. It is not a phenomenon, but is rather a category delegated to represent humanity in Sartre's thought. Sartre critiques the abstract and theoretical nature of the proletariat in Marxist discourse, suggesting that it exists more as an ideal or category in revolutionary thought rather than as a living, dynamic force. This abstract conception of the proletariat removes it from historical and material reality, turning it into a symbol rather than a concrete agent of change, which distances the idea of revolution from the actual conditions of the working class. Quote 82. Men proletarians and even leaders are no more than beings of reason. What do you want the leader to do if not to lead the revolution, says Sartre. He is himself only in being everyone. He is nothing without the proletariat. Sartre explores the existential role of revolutionary leaders, suggesting that they derive their identity solely from their connection to the proletariat and the revolution. The leader exists only through their capacity to represent and lead the collective, and their individual identity is subsumed by their role in the movement. This view underscores the dependency of leadership on the revolutionary class and the fusion of personal identity with political action in the context of Marxist theory. Quote 83. If some fact or symptom emerges to testify to its presence and its force, this is accepted only condescendingly. For when, on the contrary, such facts are lacking, nothing is changed as regards the proletariat's essence, which is always to obey the party. Sartre critiques the rigid, dogmatic view of the proletariat in communist ideology, where its loyalty to the party is considered inherent, regardless of its actual behavior. Even when evidence contradicts this loyalty, it does not alter the party's conception of the proletariat, which remains tied to obedience. This reveals a tension between the theoretical role assigned to the proletariat and the reality of its actions, highlighting the problematic relationship between the party and the working class. Quote 84. The action of a party or a government cannot afford to lose contact even momentarily with the event. Such action must remain the same and be immediately recognized throughout its different phases. Sartre emphasizes that political action, especially by a party or government, must stay connected with ongoing events and maintain consistency in its principles. Unlike speculative thought or philosophical critique, which can afford shifts or retractions, political action must be clear and continuous. Each decision must be seen as part of a larger, cohesive plan, and any disconnection from this practical engagement risks undermining the movement's credibility and effectiveness. Quote 85. The spectator consciousness is too busy seeing to see itself as a particular consciousness, and it dreams of an action which also would be ubiquitous. Sartre critiques the detached intellectual stance of the spectator consciousness, which observes events from a distance but fails to recognize its own limitations. This consciousness dreams of a universal action that can intervene everywhere but, in reality, remains disconnected from actual participation. This reflection points to the difference between observing and understanding events versus being truly involved in shaping them, highlighting the gap between theory and practice. Quote 86. Knowing everything, the spectator consciousness also knows that certain people want to change the world. Consciousness makes room for them in its universe, comprehends them like everything else, and justifies them in terms of the very thing that challenges it. Sartre suggests that the detached observer, while understanding the motivations of revolutionaries, reduces their actions to intellectual exercises that fit into the observer's own framework. The revolutionary's challenge to the status quo becomes just another subject for contemplation, rather than a call for true engagement or change. This detachment turns action into something to be analyzed and justified, rather than participated in. Quote 87. True commitment would be practically the inverse. Agreement not on principles but in an action that one is called upon to elaborate. Agreement not on particular points, but on a line which connects them. Here, Sartre defines real commitment as an active engagement in which individuals do not merely agree on abstract principles, but participate in shaping the action itself. This commitment involves more than just supporting isolated points. It requires aligning with a broader strategy and being involved in the continuous process of revolutionary change. This calls for a deeper involvement, where one's actions and beliefs are integrated into a shared, evolving purpose. Quote 88. One fears that a sympathetic attitude would prevent precisely those who want peace from working for it. Sartre warns that a purely sympathetic stance towards communism or any political movement might actually undermine efforts to achieve real peace. If individuals avoid critically examining or challenging the actions of regimes like the USSR, they risk enabling those regimes' more aggressive or problematic policies. True peace requires more than passive agreement. It demands active and critical participation in the political process, even if that means opposing certain aspects of the movements one supports. Quote 89. But if there is no dialectic, communism must be secularized. Capitalism may indeed be the exploitation of the working class, but if there is no historical moment, and even less a durable regime, how can we prefer this system? Sartre confronts the issue of communist ideology lacking a dialectical progression towards a classless society. Without a historical logic or revolutionary moment that ensures the transformation of society, communism becomes just another political system, rather than the utopian solution it claims to be. In this secularized view, both capitalism and communism have their flaws, and neither can claim to be the final, inevitable solution to social inequality. Quote 90. The fact is that the objective critique of capital hardly enters into Sartre's study. Inside an immediate or moral relationship of persons, he deliberately focuses on those that capitalism ruins, on those of whom we are starkly reminded by the gaze of the least favored. Sartre's focus is on the moral and human dimension of capitalism's victims, rather than a purely economic critique of capital. He highlights the suffering of the marginalized, arguing that the true measure of a system is how it treats its most vulnerable members. This humanistic approach shifts the emphasis from abstract economic analysis to the lived experiences of the oppressed, reinforcing the need for a moral reckoning with capitalism. Quote 91. The proletarian class exists only by the pure will of a few, as language exists only as carried by a consciousness which constitutes it. Sartre suggests that the proletariat, like language, is not an independent entity, but one that exists through the will and consciousness of individuals. It is not simply a natural outcome of social conditions, but something actively shaped and maintained by those who conceptualize and act upon it. This comparison highlights the constructed nature of both social and linguistic phenomena, emphasizing the role of human consciousness in defining and sustaining collective identities. Quote 92. Politics and action stand out over and against everything, like appendages or extensions of personal life, and this at the very moment when it is proved that they are something else. Here, Sartre points out that while politics and action may seem like mere extensions of personal life, they are, in reality, distinct and complex entities. Personal motivations and politics often intertwine, but action in the political realm takes on a life of its own, operating according to different rules and structures. This distinction between the personal and political underlines the challenges of trying to apply individual will or principles directly to political action without recognizing the larger forces at play. Quote 93. Commitment was the promise to succeed where the parties had failed. It therefore placed itself outside parties, and a preference or choice in favor of one of them made no sense at a moment when it was a question of recreating principles in contact with facts. Sartre reflects on the nature of political commitment, which for him initially involved rejecting traditional party lines in favor of a more open-ended engagement with reality. Commitment meant not aligning with a particular political party, but instead attempting to develop new principles based on lived experiences and the facts on the ground. This position highlights the tension between ideological alignment and the desire for a more fluid, adaptive approach to political engagement. Quote 94. We never choose to become or to be this or that, but to have been this or that. Sartre explores the existential concept that our choices are not made with the future in mind, but rather they are understood retrospectively. It is through looking back at our actions that we give them meaning and define who we are. This focus on the past highlights the idea that we do not deliberately choose our identities or roles in advance. Instead, our choices are understood and solidified only after they have been made, revealing the constructed nature of identity. Quote 95. Commitment is still the same brief contact with the world. It still does not take charge of it. It renders judgments only about very general principles, or about facts, and particular aspects of action. Sartre suggests that political commitment remains a limited engagement with the world, focusing on judging principles or specific actions rather than fully immersing in or taking control of the broader political landscape. Commitment offers moments of contact with political realities, but does not involve a sustained, transformative involvement. This implies that commitment, in Sartre's view, often lacks the depth needed for true political intervention and remains more reflective than active. Quote 96. Action is another commitment, both more demanding and more fragile. It obliges one always to bear more than what is promised or owed, and at the same time, it is susceptible to failure. Sartre contrasts action with commitment, emphasizing that real action requires a greater level of engagement and responsibility. Unlike commitment, which is often theoretical, action involves taking on more than expected and dealing with the inherent risk of failure. This view underscores the fragility and complexity of political action, where one must confront unforeseen challenges and be willing to go beyond initial promises or expectations. Quote 97. The preference for communism without adherence to it, like yesterday's nonpartisan critique, is an attitude, not an action. Sartre criticizes the stance of favoring communism in principle without fully committing to it as an active political movement. He sees this preference as more of a theoretical or intellectual position rather than a true political action. This detachment allows individuals to support communism from a distance without fully engaging in its practical implications, and reflects Sartre's broader critique of passive political attitudes that avoid direct involvement. In Adventures of the Dialectic, Maurice Merleau-Ponty ultimately reveals the inherent contradictions within Marxist ideology, questioning its ability to reconcile theory with practice. The book underscores the difficulty of achieving a politics that integrates human freedom with historical progress, without resorting to violence or coercion. Merleau-Ponty demonstrates that both Marxism and Western liberalism suffer from a similar inability to fully account for the complexities of human existence and historical contingency. In conclusion, he argues that the dialectic, while offering valuable insights into social and political struggles, cannot provide an absolute resolution to the tensions between individual freedom and collective history. Instead, it must be continually rethought in light of new circumstances, always bearing the weight of human ambiguity and the unpredictability of history.
Curious to dive into the mind of Maurice Merleau-Ponty? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Adventures of the Dialectic in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.